Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another countdown video. And a very big one at that. We're finally ready to finish off the discography review of my favorite band of all time, Orbital. And of course, given that they are my favorite band, I couldn't bring myself to just stop at 10 like most of the other countdowns I've done. No band or artist I've ever covered on this channel, or will ever cover on this channel, has completely dominated my entire life in the same way that Orbital has. I have had on and off periods on lots and lots of different bands over the years, but from when I discovered them in 5th grade to now as an adult, my love for their music has not remotely wavered, and they've never fallen off my radar or worn out on me. Even now, with this discography review, I've been struggling to admit that they are not perfect and are capable of making music that I don't love. But the fact remains is that I consider 5 of their 8 albums so far to be a 9 out of 10 or higher. 5. I could probably count on one hand how many other bands have accomplished even 3 9 out of 10s. And just counting 10 songs does not do justice to how much Orbital have meant to me over the years. Needless to say, this channel and my love for electronic music in general would not be a thing if it were not for these guys. Heck, their 8th album is obviously part of the channel's name. I could go on, but that's what the list is for, so let's get the usual disclaimers out of the way. This is my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. I don't take popularity into account, it's just based upon my own personal enjoyment and nostalgia. I am counting solo projects for this list as well, even if most of it is going to land in honorable mentions, but whatever. Also, this list is not final and only reflects how I feel at the moment of editing the video, so without any further ado, let's get right into the top 20 best Orbital songs. Number 20. Chime from the Green Album. So let's of course begin this list with probably the most obvious pick in their catalog. It was the first song they ever released, all the way back in 1989, and it's the track that closes out basically every one of their live sets. It's quite possibly the most iconic song they've ever released. Now, of course, this track just barely scraped the bottom of the list because I don't think it's the most interesting of Orbital songs. It has that one hook that it nails, and it has that nostalgic sample at the end, but of course there are plenty of other Orbital songs that have a lot more going on and are no less memorable from start to finish. Chime is a simple song, but because of my seeing plenty of various live sets and knowing this is the chime that signals the end of the set, usually, it gets that much more emotional power in order to get it onto this list. An obvious choice for sure, but it's one that no Best Orbital Songs list would feel complete without. And as a side note, there are more than a few good versions of this track. The best one is the 8-minute edit from the USA version of the Green Album. Anyway, moving on. Number 19. Haven't We Met Before from The Ideal Condition. So, on the exact flip side, we have probably the least obvious choice on this list. I did not expect to be putting any of Paul or Phil's solo work on the main list, let alone something from The Ideal Condition, which is the only primarily negative review I've ever given to anything Orbital related. Well, okay, Pusher as well, but that's a film soundtrack, doesn't count. But for whatever weaknesses The Ideal Condition has as a cohesive whole and on other individual tracks, it makes up for with some standouts that hit ridiculous highs. Most notably this track, the album's opener. I just have almost no words for how freaking amazing this track is. Paul conducting a full orchestra is something of a dream come true for me, and while on the rest of the album it maybe didn't end up quite as awesome as it sounded, this is everything I could have hoped for out of it. Amazing, grand epic orchestrations, complete with an operatic soloist, and of course Paul adding an electronic beat underneath to give it that little Orbital flair. I wasn't sure if this track truly deserved to make the list given my ambivalence towards the album and my still maintaining the stance that Paul and Phil are equally important to the Orbital equation, but the feels on this one track are real, and I realized it had to be on here. Go check it out. Number 18. Style from the Middle of Nowhere. Going back to somewhat more obvious choices, this one of course made it onto the list mainly because of nostalgia and being one of the first Orbital tracks I ever heard, but also because it takes advantage of nostalgia by already kind of being like a warm and fuzzy sort of track, with lots of happy bleeping synth melodies and grand sweeping melodic washes, weird percussion, and of course the sample at the end that goes, "Now I'm aching for you, now I'm aching for you." Don't have a lot to say really, loved it when I first heard it, and still love it just as much, if not even more now. Number 17. Midnight from the Green Album. Now this is a seriously underrated track in my opinion. I'd even go as far to say it's grown to become my favorite track from the Green Album overall. There's a lot going on, the dramatic synth pads at the beginning, the rock guitar synths in the most intense parts, the weird tropical sounding progressions in the middle. Every single little part makes for a highly interesting feels journey that I think really deserves more credit than it's gotten. Number 16. Dwer Booter from Insides. Orbital may be more well known for making songs primarily created to dance to, and while this track is of course somewhat danceable, it's here more because of its haunting atmosphere that's almost kind of film soundtracky and even led them to making film soundtracks of their own, see Octane. So many cool sounds flying around in this track, it's almost kind of like you're flying through space or something. It's quite beautiful and melodic on the first half, but gets rather dark and menacing in the second half, and still makes an almost seamless transition between the two halves. And on top of that, it's even kinda got a message too. Like, the title is Welsh for dirty water, adding to the environmental theme of Insides. It's a unique entry into Orbital's catalog that is just one of the reasons why that particular album is my number one favorite of all time. Number 15. Times Fly Slow from the Times Fly EP. Orbital making a straight chill-out song in almost sounds from the ground style or something still seems like a weird concept to me, but here we are. And lo and behold, it is absolutely fantastic. With warm synth pads, ethereal vocals, and banging percussion. The synth pad melody on this track is pure awesome, and as someone who appreciates basically any music made to just kinda kick back and relax to, I will welcome with open arms this highly unique Orbital track. Go check it out if you haven't already, and while you're at it, also go check out the alternate demo version of this track called Equinox, which is not that different, but no less cool listening experience. Number 14. Funny Break, One Is Enough from the Altogether. I'll admit the Altogether's probably not going to be that well represented on this list, despite my belief that it is way better than most people give it credit for. And that's because the Altogether's an album that I like more for how it comes together as a whole than I do for any one specific track. Most of which I like all about the same amount. But I do undoubtedly have a favorite track from that album, and this is it. The happy-go-lucky build-ups to the jazzy payoff with lots of beautiful vocals from Naomi Bedford and plenty of awesome horn sections. It's just a fantastic track, and I wish Orbital would bring this one back into their live sets again sometimes. Number 13. Ignans from Insides. Going back to that whole moody soundtracky thing I was talking about with Dwer Booter, This also carries over to the track directly following it on the album. Maybe not quite as atmospheric as that one, but the melodies are even more addicting than on that one. The percussion patterns are absolutely off the wall. As a kid, I compared it to some kind of noisy industrial-grade coffee machine. This is a song that simultaneously is weird and quirky, but also intense, haunting, and emotional. I loved it immediately as a kid, and it's still one of the highlights of Orbital's entire career to this day. Ridiculously underrated track. Number 12. Don't Stop Me, non-album single. Speaking of ridiculously underrated tracks, this may come off as somewhat of an unusual choice, especially given that I more often see love for the B-side to the single, The Gun Is Good, but I've always been much more drawn to this one. And it completely blew my mind right on first listen, especially given that it was Orbital announcing their reformation for the first time. The synth progressions are absolutely freaking addicting. Every single sample, from the vocoder saying, "Don't stop me, to shut up, shut up, shut up, to, of course, the video killed the radio star snippets, ow wah, ow wah. This song is such a freaking amazing pump-up anthem, and so catchy on top of that, that I associate those little video killed the radio star samples more with this song than the original song they came from at this point. Love this song so freaking much. Number 11. Impact, The Earth Is Burning, from the Brown album. Okay, here's another obvious one. This is already widely considered an Orbital classic and a mainstay in Orbital's live sets, but still for good reason. The banging and driving beat, the haunting string wash hanging over the entire track, the weird but super addicting melodies, the bell noises that get an entire little sidetrack section to themselves, the car horn-like synths, and of course the outro, which takes things into a darker passage with plenty of memorable samples like "The Earth is Burning" and "It's a Cry for Survival." It goes on for 10 minutes and makes use of every single second it's around. Even somewhat enhanced by the USA version, which adds some really haunting sections in the second half as well. Actually, I probably prefer the original album version, as that one focuses more on the first half, which I like more, but the USA version has been growing on me. Regardless, amazing track, and you probably already knew that. And now that we're halfway into the list, I think this would be a good time just to get the honorable mentions out of the way, so let's get right into that, shall we? Attached, from Snivelization. Omen, non-album single. Lost, from the Blue Album. Just One More, from Madness in Me. Steel Cube Idolatry, from the Green Album. 858, from 858. Kein Trinkwasser, from Snivelization. Pants, from the Blue Album. For Silence, from The Ideal Condition. Walk Now, from the Brown Album. Oi, from the Altogether. Skad for Life, from Back to Mine. Madness in Me, from Madness in Me.
So your impression.
Tunnel Vision, from the Blue Album. Satan, from the Green Album. Frenetic, non-album single.
Finally hear your face in my mind. Seen it there before.
Jesus Christ, I'm gonna be stuck here forever if I don't stop somewhere, so Let's get into the top 10 now, shall we? Also, let's change up our buffer music because this is where shit gets real. Number 10. Wonky from Wonky. When I first heard this track, I thought it was terrible. Not only was there basically only a melody in one little part in the middle, but they also brought along a rapper? What the heck are you doing, Orbital? Don't you know that all rap music is shit? But later I found something oddly catchy about it, and now it's probably the biggest pump-up anthem that Orbital have ever made. Lady LaSure's rapping is ridiculously fun and ridiculously fast, somehow easily memorable despite the fact that I still can't understand like half of what she's saying. But Orbital's beat is so intense that it gets me to start dancing automatically almost, even if I'm trying to write down in Google Drive why I love the song so much. And the speed is taking over me section I liked immediately is now just only one part of it. Fucking amazing. Number 9. Planet of the Shapes from the Brown album. Here's a track that is both heavily underrated in my opinion, but also a really favorite of mine. When I first heard it in 2007, I really thought it was like going on a journey into space on a desolate planet that just so happened to have like these weird shape creatures on it. And it still holds up just as amazingly well as it did back in the day, with so many cool elements in this track, from the kinda creepy even a stopped clock gives the right time twice a day sample that made me think, whoa, that's deep as a kid, to the intense and driving beat and bass line, to the weird breathing noises, to the psychedelic samples and sitars and flutes. Everything comes together to create a truly stunning track that can still succeed in taking me to another place, and I'm really surprised it did not become more of a mainstay in Orbital's back catalog. Number 8. Nothing Left from the Middle of Nowhere. This track had the chance to become a big mainstay in the Orbital catalog given that it was released as a single from this album, but it seems to have been kind of left by the wayside in favor of older tracks of theirs. That doesn't mean it's any less impressive in its full 15-minute two-parter glory. Heck, the two parts almost don't really justify being separate songs in some ways. The first part being entirely built up and the second part paying it all off, but not sounding that different. I do happen to like the second part more as it got some catchier melodies involved in it. And that big long build-up section with a video game-like sense. But it's not quite as effective without part 1 to prop it up, featuring the metallic ambient intro that also bookends the full track and lots of dark passages. And of course, Alison Goldfrapp's excellent nonsense vocals all over both parts are the little icing on the cake, and the thing that brings everything together and lands this entire track on my top 10 favorite Orbital tracks of all time. Number 7. One Perfect Sunrise from the Blue Album. This track may have the distinct disadvantage of being directly compared to an already existing Orbital track, being Halcyon, but this track manages to pull off a very similar effect and work completely on its own merits. The way I've always seen this track is kind of like a goodbye song for Orbital, even though they've obviously put out new material since this album. This still feels like this is the track that Orbital created to send off their entire career. It's simultaneously energetic and uplifting, with some fun little acid housey side tracks, while also having a strong sense of melancholy to go along with it, thanks to the moaning vocals of Lisa Gerrard from Dead Can Dance, and also plenty of other ambient sections, especially one section in the middle which has no beats at all and even brings in what sounds like a full choir. one of the most emotionally potent tracks Orbital has ever made. Number 6. Where Is It Going? From Wonky. Meanwhile, this track, which for a while was going to be the real send-off to Orbital's career, has the exact opposite effect as One Perfect Sunrise. Still feels like an ending, but a way happier and much more hopeful ending. The track that ended the album, which showed Orbital with their freshest and most energetic material in a long time. This was a track that made me less think that Orbital were sneaking in one more emotional slugger to close out their career, but rather made me think that Orbital were really confirming that they were back in the game, that they were ready to go and do new things again. Even ending the track on an unresolved note, seeming to imply greater things to come. And of course the melody of this track is addicting, and it just makes me so happy whenever I listen to it. A song that really gets me pumped up to hear more Orbital in the future, and now that they're back together here in 2017, we may finally be able to answer the question posed in the title. Number 5. The Girl with the Sun in Her Head, from Insides. Speaking of songs that make me really happy whenever I hear them, this is a pretty obvious choice, being the opener to my all-time favorite album, starting out quite subtle with a heartbeat sound and reversed bell-like noises, but then breaking out into one of the most intense and euphoric tracks they've ever made, with video game-like synth melodies, giant emotional pads, choir-like synths, and organ-like synths, all super catchy and emotional. I don't really know what else to say to this track, it's just fantastic. Number 4. Spare Parts Express, from the Middle of Nowhere. I wasn't really expecting this track to be ranked this highly in the list, but it fits, given that it's the first song I ever heard from Orbital, the song that kicked off my journey into electronic music. When I first heard it, my mind was completely blown. Not only was it 10 minutes long, but it also sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before in my life, just encompassing so many different sounds and emotions, from happy in the beginning to more ambiguous sections in the middle, and that really dark and creepy section near the end. It felt like I was going on a musical adventure, and every melody and passage was addicting and memorable, and I was completely captivated from start to finish. Especially impressive for this little 5th grader with ADD, it was like I was listening to a movie inside of a song. Obviously they've topped it since, in my opinion. I think there are other tracks that accomplish similar effects or have better melodies, but this track still sounds impressive to me and is no less fun or addicting at age 21, so this, combined with my obvious history, make it a true standout in Orbital's discography. Number 3. Are We Here? From Civilization. I'm sure some people may be lamenting the lack of material from Civilization on this list, but whatever. This may be the longest track I've ever completely memorized. 15 minutes of intense, fast-paced drum and bass that feels like it's racing through a dense jungle, which is fitting, given how this genre is often called jungle sometimes. A song that evolves from intriguing and mysterious and hazy at the beginning, to dark and intense and driving in the middle, to uplifting and melodic by the end, all while involving plenty of catchy vocalizations from Alison Goldfrapp, and various voice samples like "What Does God Say?" and "Whiny Whiny Yogira Doc?" and "Prodigal Son is alive and well and living in the front bedroom," among others. Just a truly mind-blowing song that has so much packed into its 15 minutes and yet remains so easily memorable from start to finish. If there's any complaint I might have, it's that there are shorter versions of this track that exist, and I kinda hate all of them because they basically miss the entire point of the track. You need the full 15 minutes for the full effect. Regardless, love the shit out of this song. Number 2. Out There Somewhere from Insides. Spare Parts Express blew my mind at 10 minutes, Are We Here blew my mind at 15 minutes, but Out There Somewhere is 24 minutes. When I first discovered this track as a little kid, I was so mind blown that I wanted to call Guinness World Records. Granted, it is split up into 2 parts, but both parts are their own distinct musical journeys themselves, with the first being dark and UFO themed with a creepy and unsettling ambient intro, later with lots of buzzing bass lines and high-pitched whistling melodies. Felt like you were being blasted off into space. And in the second part, it was almost like you were flying through the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and reached such euphoric levels it was almost like a religious experience. Even as a kid, I was like, is this what we hear when we die? There are so many absolutely fantastic melodies with almost orchestral synths. I still can barely believe a track of this caliber even exists. Hell, sometimes if I'm in the right mood, this is my number 1 favorite track on the list and of all time. It's only at number 2 right now though, since it took me until high school for me to completely get over my fear of listening to the second part again and truly realize it's a genius. Therefore, there's not as much nostalgia as it probably should have, but it is my favorite track from my favorite album of all time, and only one track they've ever made tops it, even if just by a hair. So you ready to find out what that number 1 is? Number 1. Blue Illusion, non-album single. This is a song I'll bet not many of you have heard at all, but its spacey vibe is really something else, something almost unlike Orbital have ever done. Really chill and with some great melodies to boot. If Out There Somewhere was like you being blasted off into the outer reaches of the galaxy, this track is just you floating out there in the middle of space and just soaking up all the beauty around you. Now I'm sure some people are going to say, hey, wait a minute, Tommy, you can't put this on the list. This song isn't even by Orbital, it's by someone called BZ and got associated with the Orbital name by complete accident. And my response is, well, yeah. But the alternative is to call attention to a subpar trance song or this god-awful thing made by people intentionally ripping off Orbital's name for a quick buck, because there's no way I could actually subvert anyone's expectations with my real number 1, which is Halcyon. Yep, surprise. Blue Illusion is a good song that's worth checking out, and even if it really were by Orbital, which is an understandable mistake because it actually sounds like them, it could have maybe been an honorable mention, but yeah. I think most people already knew my number 1 long before I'd even started work on this video. As I've said on multiple occasions, this track is my favorite track of all time, period. It may not be as impressive as Out There Somewhere, but what Halcyon has over everything is mainly pure nostalgia. If Out There Somewhere is a journey into space and then into heaven, Halcyon will probably be the music that I hear when I'm actually in heaven. I loved it when I first heard the live version from the end of the US version of Insides, being the first track I ever bought off iTunes, and while I was at first disappointed that the original album version had no Bon Jovi or Belinda Carlisle samples, it eventually way surpassed the live version, just thanks to the fact that this version is just so masterfully produced, with some absolutely immersive atmospherics, and it got lodged in my number 1 spot, and hasn't moved from that spot for nearly a decade now. I barely have much of anything to say outside of mindlessly raving about it. The ambient synths are beautiful, Kirsty Hawkshaw's voice is beautiful, the bass line is awesome. There is not a single element about this song which I don't believe is absolutely perfect. It is my favorite song of all time, and of course, my number 1 favorite song by my number 1 favorite band. And that is the end of this list. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. And And before you dump all the suggestions for my next discography review, I do actually have one, or really two in mind, but I will be discussing that later. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.